This is Alec.
And this is Jack.
Welcome to another episode of Smith and Scholar. Smith and Scholar is a multimedia project dedicated to promoting and encouraging young men to pursue and live the good life. Let's go.
Let's do it. You okay?
I don't know if I'm going to keep that for the...
I'll do what he normally does. And we're back.
All right, Jack, thank you for welcoming us back.
You're welcome.
What is an activity that all of us have engaged in at one point in our life that requires the opening of a tool and the looking at different symbols and letters on the page?
Reading?
You got it.
Oh, look at me.
And
Gold star.
Yeah, we're staying on track for our pithy description and your excellent guess. Although
I wouldn't really call it a
guess.
guess.
It's not really a guess. Okay. So today, yes, we are talking about reading, and we've kind of covered it in the past with study, leisure. Today we're getting, I guess, a deeper dive into reading, and it's going to be a little bit of a lighter episode.
I'd say so.
Than what we're used to. Usually we get into real, like, heavy duty,
nitty-gritty,
black and white problems of how to live the good life. And today we're just taking a little more casual.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a good one because we talked about leisure, and reading can be a leisurely activity. So, yeah. So I mean, we can go ahead and jump right into it.
Yeah, I think everybody knows what reading is. If you don't, go back to the intro where I described it. But let's go ahead and move forward. So we're each going to talk a little bit about our background in reading. So I'll go ahead and start. I will say that I've loved reading since I was young. Back in elementary and junior high, we had this advanced reading program or advanced reader program, the AR program, where you read a book and you take tests and you get points. And I wasn't always on the highest tier of points, but often I'd get a bunch of prizes for reading a lot of books. And then once I got into high school, there was no AR program, but then I started getting into more historical books, especially as we keep mentioning, one of our teachers in history was a great influence, and I wanted to be prepared for those classes. And so I'd read external books, which I think often hurt my standing in the class because they're very different, not mainstream history books, but that's something we can talk about later. Then going into college, I had a huge library, and it was great because I would usually read a book a week, and maybe to the detriment of some of my grades freshman year, but at least I read a lot of books, and it happened to be mostly fiction. And then one year in college, I actually read 2 books a week on average, and this includes both physical books and audiobooks, so I was reading a ton, and that was probably my junior year, that whole year. So yeah, it was great. I read a lot. And then I also got into online articles in college. So now that I've finished college, undergraduate, and I'm in graduate school, married, and have a kid, I do read less overall, but I also now am rereading old books that I read in high school and college. Usually they are nonfiction, but oftentimes they are fiction, some great books, like mainly science fiction, actually, when I do reread books. But I do it so I can get a refresher on what they were talking about, or, get some sort of idea of what I remember the topics that I was covering. And then one thing that I do when I read now is I don't always read a book cover to cover, especially nonfiction. For fiction, I basically read it cover to cover.
Uh-huh.
But nonfiction, what I like to do is pick a certain chapter or section in the book and read that because I remember certain parts well enough. I just want to get a refresher on that one instance. And I guess moving forward, I now read to my kid little books. It's not like they really understand it that much, but it's fun to read, and I hope to continue reading for myself and inspire my children, future children, in reading.
I will say that my pedigree in reading is not that impressive as Alex. I definitely have never spent a year in which I could honestly say that I've read a book a week or 2 books a week. But what I will say is that from a young age, my parents really encouraged me to read. one of my earliest memories of reading outside of like school was one year at the school I was attending at the time. My parents went to the auction gala fundraiser type thing, and one of the silent auction items was a basket of books, of children's books, and my parents won it, and they brought it home, and there were a bunch of books in it, and one of the books that was in it was Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, and had never read a Harry Potter book in my life. I think I was like 6 years old at the time, so it's probably a little bit above my reading comprehension. But I like decided I was like I had seen like probably one of the two of the movies, or at least one of the movies, probably
One,
yeah,
yeah.
Sorcerer's Stone, and I was like, oh, I know Harry Potter, like I'll try and read the book. And my parents remembered like I picked the book up and read it, and they were pretty impressed, and they were like, oh man, this kid likes to read. So I started reading a lot, and just growing up, my parents weren't big on daycare or that sort of thing. So during the summer, we had to follow my mom everywhere she went. We're too young to be left alone at home, me and my brother. So we had to go grocery shopping, appointments, all that stuff. And we always had books with us. So, if you're like in the car, you can read. If you're, mom's got a doctor's appointment, you can wait in the waiting room area and read all that stuff. And we would go to the library all the time during the summer. I mean, it's kind of sad. The library near us has been under repair since Hurricane Harvey, and it's so sad because it was like a brand new library and beautiful. I mean, very modern, but still beautiful, and I mean, tons of books and that sort of thing. And
Kendall.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, I mean, just it's so sad. Hopefully, they'll get it back up. Who knows if they will or not?
Actually, yes.
Oh,
I
really?
mean, this isn't relevant to the listeners, but this, I mean, it's relevant to, I guess, the listeners in general
Right.
because this library has been out of service for 3 years now.
Yeah, 2017.
Yeah, since 2017. And just recently, they started accepting bids to refurbish the library.
Okay, cool.
So this is important because at least the community is still actively engaged in promoting reading and education for the community.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, so that's awesome. And that, so as far as like books that I like to read when I was a child, I mean, I think most kids love fiction. And so I loved Harry Potter. I read all the Harry Potter books. I wasn't one of those kids who pre-ordered and then waited till got there at midnight and picked it up, but I pre-ordered a lot of the books, and then my parents would take me the next day and I'd pick it up first thing. The last couple books, I guess we were like in middle school when they came out. And
Yeah.
if they came out in the summer, I'd pick it up and I'd read it cover to cover in one day. And so, I mean, just I like those books. And then I love the series of Unfortunate Events books. I think part of my like dry, witty, weird, sarcastic humor that I sometimes exhibit is definitely a result of reading those books.
You never exhibit that kind of humor.
Really? I knew that was a joke.
Yeah.
And then there was a series I loved called Ranger's Apprentice. And it was all about this, it's kind of like a medieval but fantasyland kind of thing. And I never read all of them, but I read the first couple, and it was like, the story of a kid who becomes a ranger, and really cool. But I also loved history, and so like my parents, my dad loved history growing up, and so my dad had all these old books from when he was a kid that my grandma would mail to us, and I would read those, and that's kind of one of the things that kicked off my love for history and law and politics and all that stuff. And so, I mean, I had all sorts of almanacs, encyclopedias, those sorts of things. There's a great series called the Don't Know Much series. So it was like, don't know much about, I think they were about people. So it was like, don't know much about Albert Einstein, or don't know much about, I might be confusing them. Maybe there was
Is it the kind of caricature?
Yeah, was that the
big
Who
head?
Was or the Don't Know Much About series?
I don't know, but
'Cause
I'm familiar with the People series.
Okay, so there was that, and then there was this other series I think was more broad, like American history or world history stuff. And I loved those. And like Alec, I have also had less time to read since, starting school, doing undergraduate, now in law school. I will say that I do read a lot, but not for pleasure. I read for, for school, and like law school is a lot of reading. So at least I have the reading skills, which is a good thing. So like there's a benefit, and we can talk about skill, things you pick up from reading later. But I also love to revisit books that we read in high school, particularly Shakespeare, and then some of the stuff we read like junior and senior year of high school, like 1984, Brave New World, not a huge fan of Great Gatsby. I love some of the Jane Austen books. Pride and Prejudice is phenomenal. If you want to read a book about someone who's a good man and is pursuing the good life and virtue, Mr. Darcy is should be
Mr. Darcy.
should be like primo example number one. So pick up the book, read it, and then watch the movie because I think the movie's pretty good too.
Yeah.
And then finally, right now, I'm trying to get more in the audiobooks, recognizing that I'm in the car quite a bit, and I could use that time for other things like listening to a book
or a podcast.
Like
Smith and Scholar.
I'm not sure if I'll listen to my own voice. Maybe. I mean, we do it for editing and stuff, so I don't know if I need to listen to it again.
Yeah.
I'm going to be a lawyer, but I don't love the sound of my voice that much.
Well, when you're a politician, you will.
Yeah, it's probably true.
All right, so we have touched upon this in the past, but we're going to talk a little bit about why you should read or why one should read. And so primarily, like we talked about in study, it's to learn. And when we say learn, again, we've kind of covered this before, but you learn other ideas, you learn about history, you learn about culture. And then in the specific context of, Jack, what you're reading right now for school, it's a little bit different, right?
Yeah, no, it's very different. I mean, it's more, the reading is somewhat for like gathering information, but a lot of it's more like how to think. It's more analytical reading and, using and developing a way to analyze and think about things. But yeah, no, certainly it's very much an idea and understanding of learning.
Yeah, and then I think another reason to read is to grow an imagination. And it might sound a little bit juvenile, perhaps, to say like, oh, growing your imagination. But I think it's a really important aspect of leisure is to also have this idea of imagination, being able to be, I guess, creative in what you're thinking and what you're doing. And also within that realm, especially since we're both big fans of nonfiction, I think it's really cool to imagine what these worlds, people, and places might look like. And so as opposed to watching a movie, you can read a book and really kind of have those images be created in your own head.
Yeah, and then I think there's another aspect of imagination that I'd like to bring up. And it comes from, Russell Kirk, who is a conservative thinker. And there's actually a website blog that encapsulate this. It's called The Imaginative Conservative. And they're kind of big on, like, you think imaginative conservative, like you'd think like politics and stuff, but it's kind of different. Like they do a lot of like book and literature reviews. And the reason for that is because they understand, particularly like classic literature, they think develops what they call your moral imagination. And this is something that Russell Kirk believed. And I think that's true. Like, you should believe this regardless of, like, it's the imaginative conservative. If you're more left-leaning, don't ignore it, because reading, like Alex said, helps you to build an imagination. And like, going back to my example about Mr. Darcy, if you're reading about Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, you're building your moral imagination. You're learning about, thinking about, like, circumstances in which he acted and exhibited virtue and morality, and then you can apply those in your own life, and you're building your own moral imagination. So I think that's really cool, and we can get more into that with reading, but I think that's just like something I think to tack on to as far as imagining.
Yeah, and hopefully what Jack just said rings a bell with regards to prudence and kind of how we can learn more about prudence and how to practice prudence, because while we said it's impossible to simulate everything, one aspect is potentially learning about different circumstances and how to apply. So that's on point. Sure. And so I guess we'll go ahead and talk about it, and then we'll leave one of the later topics for after this. But yeah, forming yourself. To read will help form yourself. And I think, Jack, you put it pretty well with moral imagination. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's what kind of encapsulates exactly what we wanted to say. As far as I'm sorry I jumped ahead, but I think that's that's exactly what we mean when we're saying to form ourselves. And just it gives you an understanding of it gives you ideas of who you should want to be and how to go about doing that, right?
Yeah, and again, it can be explicitly or implicitly learning the virtues. Again, reading a character and seeing what they do in certain circumstances implicitly informs your virtue or knowledge of virtue. And then if you're reading, again, something like Nicomachean Ethics, then it's more explicit in virtue. And then the last point of reading is pleasure, because reading for reading's sake, to enjoy yourself, enjoy your time, I think that's another valid reason to read.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess add on to that what we kind of mentioned already, leisure, and everything that goes in. If you're wondering what we mean by that, go back and listen to our episode about leisure and its relation to culture, and rest and all that stuff.
Yeah, great. So now we talked about why you should read, but what are some things you can read?
We've kind of already mentioned this a little bit, talking about our development in reading. But obviously there's books, there's articles. Something that I mean, this is like what you get when you read Shakespeare. Plays are great. So many things, right? It's an the world of reading is really an open book. Yeah, everybody laugh. But I mean, to be honest, books are harder to read nowadays because of time. For me personally, I'm sure a lot of our listeners and viewers feel the same way. So articles I think, are a good substitute, but they're not. Maybe I shouldn't say substitute. They're a nice, alternative to books, and so that's a good way to like quickly learn about something or something you're interested in. Um, and I mean, not like news articles. I mean, news articles are great to learn, but I think when we were talking about reading and developing, particularly like moral imagination and trying to form ourselves, I think good article, literature reviews. And by literature reviews, I don't mean like in the like scientific field literature review. I mean like,
Which I read a lot of.
yeah, I bet. I mean, like a book review, but that dives in a little deeper and that sort of thing, so you can kind of get an idea and that. I guess that's how I feel about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then audiobooks, I think it's
Yeah.
not necessarily reading cuz you're listening, but it's still the same idea of you're getting this knowledge from a
hmm
book but in audio format rather than visual format.
hmm Yeah, definitely. And I mean, then you're still using the wheels in your head to paint the picture.
Yeah. So then, as we normally do, some virtues that you can develop while reading. So we talked about forming yourself, but what are some specific virtues? So in line with the cardinal virtues, I think fortitude is a very important
hmm
virtue that's needed or developed during reading because you can start a book, that's really easy, but sometimes finishing the book takes perseverance.
No, certainly, yeah, and I think as well. You need some prudence, right? I mean, there's so many books out there, and so you have to be able to choose the right book. And I mean, obviously, this is that seems like a little extreme, but there's a lot of books out there. And you only have so much time, um, and I think those are good virtues to kind of think about when in relation to reading. Um, you know, we we've kind so I guess that's like a way to show that reading is a good like that's a good way to grow an appreciation of reading in a way too, is thinking about like the virtues you can learn and the virtues you can use and grow in reading. um but moving on, like, are there do you have any personal reasons for reading? And our listeners can think of some, I think along with this question, like, what are some personal reasons you might have for reading?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, a or fiction and science fiction within that is probably my favorite genre, and
hmm
I mean it kind of differs every day. But when I'm reading fiction, really it's for pleasure. It's to have a good story and relax. And then for nonfiction specifically, it's to learn something. And not to say that I don't also read non or fiction not to learn something,
hmm
but nonfiction it's a much more concerted effort to learn something out of it.
yeah, and I those are basically my reasons for reading as well. I think those are probably universal reasons for reading.
Yeah.
Um, but do you have? And you've kind of mentioned this already. Do you have? Can you talk about some of your favorite genres and why they're your favorite genres?
Yeah, so science fiction I love because it's amazing to see all the world building, the planets, and then oftentimes science fiction takes modern political or cultural problems and then puts them in a different universe
hmm
for you to kind of separate yourself from it a little bit. So I really like how that's done, especially with short stories. I'm a big fan of short sci-fi short stories. Then thriller, I love thriller books because they're short. It's kind of like cheap because it's really fast and
hmm
easy to get through, but it's a fun story at the end. Mystery, I love mystery, and I'll get into like my favorite books or series later, but just the story and explanation and the specific books are great. And then other genres, I really like history and philosophy in general. And again, that's why do I like those? Well, I learn a lot, and then it also helps just develop again me as a person as I'm going through. So, and you, Jack, any favorite genres?
So I really like history and biographies as far as nonfiction goes, particularly about presidents and wars. I just find those interesting. And I think it's mostly because like my grandfather was a World War II vet, and my dad knows a lot about World War II, and so like that was just naturally started reading about World War II, and now I've read about the Civil War and other things. Someone interested in politics. It's fun to read about the presidents and the things that they faced in their lives, then as political figures. And then on the fiction side, uh, I kind of enjoy all sorts of stuff. I really love some of the like great classics. Frankenstein, Dracula. So kind of those are in horror genre, which is different but fun. Um, I like I mentioned earlier. Um, I like there's what was it? Like I said, like like fantasy. I mentioned some of the series earlier, and I started getting into like legal thriller, fiction books. So like John Grisham.
Yes, I love those
Yeah,
books.
yeah. So I've watched the movie 2 or 3 times, The Firm, and I just read the book for the first time, and it's really good. And now I think the next one I'm gonna read is A Time to Kill, which is another good one by him. And then we also have The Pelican Brief at home. So like we have all his books, so I'm gonna read them all. And I really enjoyed The Firm. And so I've kind of jumped into it, talking about personal favorites and book series. So, Alec, do you have any personal favorites as far as specific series or books?
Yeah. So when you brought up the John Grisham, it reminded me when I read a few in a row, and I think after reading each one, I would usually text you and be like, "Hey, Jack, does this happen in the law world?" And this was before you started law school, but still, I think it happened a few times because.
Well, having read The Firm, and there's going to be like a spoiler alert here. Well, I'll keep it general. The illegal things that happen in The Firm, I don't think that's real, but I will say, like when they talk about billable hours and trying to bill as much as possible and working young associates to the bone. From what I hear, I haven't worked in a firm full time yet, but having done a summer program or two and having talked to people, those things are all true.
All right, that's good to know, and glad that I didn't go down the lawyer path. But yes, my favorite series, one of my favorite authors in the mystery series is Agatha Christie. And
okay.
Specifically within that, I love the Poirot books. And it's because Poirot is such a fun character. And the way that each book is written is not from the point of view of Poirot, but somebody who's helping him. So sometimes it's the same guy for a few books, or it switches authors per se. And so it's really fun to see his kind of unassuming and apparently bumbling perspective on a case, and everybody's like, "Oh, what's this Poirot? He's useless," and he's a very humble guy, and reveals at the end everything that was going on. Then in sci-fi, my favorite series is definitely the Ender series by Orson Scott Card.
I've never read the entire series, but I love Ender's Game.
I read Ender's Game, I think 12 times in 1 year, I think in 6th grade.
Wow.
I just read it like every other week or so. And I have not read it. I don't think I've read it 12 times since 6th grade, but that's probably covered me for quite a bit of time. But then all the books after that, because they really get into a lot of deep philosophical discussions that when I was reading them the first time around, I definitely was not old enough to understand everything that was going on.
Alec and I did a project on Ender's Game our freshman year of high school together.
Yeah. And so that was a lot easier to understand, but the specific images we took from that book was the Giant's Game, which was very interesting, I guess, exploration to the psyche of Ender and decisions and what it meant for him as a person. Okay, and then moving on, like I mentioned, I like history books. I like a lot of American history. That's basically the genre of history that I read. I've tried reading more international history. Like I read half a book on Russia and the Byzantine Empire, but haven't been as involved outside of American history.
Okay.
And it's usually been colonial America up until Civil War is my favorite time period to read. And then I actually like reading language books, and that means like an Italian textbook or something. Like I read that, and I kind of learned Italian throughout the process. It took a lot of time, but
he's a Renaissance man, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, try to be the good Renaissance, right? So the good aspect of the Renaissance,
the good aspects.
But yeah, that's what I like. So now that we talked about that, I think we can sum it up in how reading is tied to the good life. And again, now that we've kind of talked about the good life in multiple episodes, and usually with the same kind of tie-up somewhere in there of how is this related? Why are we talking about this? We have talked about it in study, but I think you can see that the good life is pretty much in sync with reading.
Yeah, no, definitely. You learn a lot from reading, right? And, like, for instance, our podcast here, a lot of our content, we pull from various pieces of literature, whether it's fiction, some of the stories we read, some of the books we've read, or nonfiction. We've talked about different biographies and that sort of thing. So, it's very practical. And then you mentioned earlier, you can learn directly about virtues, or learn, you can read, like you said, like you can read Nicomachean Ethics and learn about virtue ethics and the virtues and like what that means. Or you can read, Pride and Prejudice and, see Mr. Darcy and learn, from the characters in a book about what it means to be a good man. And you pursue virtue. So I think that's another way in which reading is tied to the good life.
Yeah, and then getting into leisure, how we talked about leisure is integral to the good life and building culture. Well, reading is a really good way to practice leisure,
Mhm.
and it is a leisurely activity as long as it's ordered and you're reading a good book. So I think that's another way. And then finally, in line with leisure, if you're reading something, and maybe more so for books that have a little more deeper thought or literature, kind of literary elements, it really promotes reflection and contemplation. And again, contemplation being the highest kind of end goal of leisure. So I think that's one way to look at it, and how reading and the good life are tied together.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I think that gets tied back into, maybe the most important aspect of reading, being it's a good way to form yourself. It's a good way to develop your moral imagination. And it's like in this way of reflecting and contemplating what you're reading is where you can truly begin to learn about virtue and apply it in your life. And that, I think the cool thing about, talking about this is I don't think people often are thinking about this when they're reading, right? And so that the fact that we're talking about this, I hope it brings to the attention that reading is a very good way to pursue the good life. It's not just something we do for fun or because we have to, but it's definitely something that we can actively take and make a part of our pursuit of the good life. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Smith and Scholar. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast on all the major platforms, including YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. Also, follow us on Twitter to stay up to date with everything we are doing and thinking.
Finally, feel free to give us feedback and ask questions across the different platforms. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, this is Smith and Scholar.